The other thing that was critical in an environment like this, because there are so many, bright people and there is a lot of history, was getting alignment involved really giving people an opportunity to share their opinions and participate in the process.
Welcome to the Tearsheet podcast. I'm Zack Miller. Technology continues to infuse new product offerings, but tech's influence is also permeating organizational structures and internal processes in some of the largest financial firms. When Barry Libenson joined Experian 4 years ago as the global CIO, he entered a very different organization than Experian is today. Individuals and teams have a natural aversion to change. That makes digital transformation hard, especially at global scale. Barry joins us to talk about how he embarked on a digital transformation at Experian and describes how deeply change was felt across the organization. He addresses the nuances digital faces in the financial industry and the tools and techniques he used to infuse his firm with a vision of tomorrow. People matter, and Barry makes the point that, in a big way, digital transformation isn't really about technology. Barry Libenson is my guest today on the Tearsheet podcast.
Hi, Zack. First, my name's Barry Libenson. I'm the Global Chief Information Officer for Experian, the Global Credit Bureau. So I'm responsible for the overall technology strategy and direction, as well as operations of our technology platforms inside of Experian.
And so when you joined Experian in 2015 as a CIO, what kind of organization did you enter at that moment?
Yeah, when I joined Experian 4 years ago, the organization was structured somewhat differently from a technology perspective. There was a much more autonomous, sort of decentralized operating model in place, which worked very well for the company when it was smaller, and getting synergies wasn't nearly as important. But as the company has grown, the need for a more centralized and standardized approach to how we do things became pretty obvious. But 4 years ago, we were in a pretty different operating model, technology-wise, from where we are today.
And were you hired to sort of spearhead a transformation project?
I was hired to sort of look at the overall technology landscape within the organization, bring some cohesion to the way things were done, and look for opportunities where we could advance our platforms through the use of technology and address customer needs more closely. So while this specific task wasn't transformation, it certainly was something that was a consideration when I joined the organization.
And I know this is a very ambiguous question, but you've been the CIO of quite a few large U.S. corporations. Why is transformation so hard? Digital transformation so hard?
Yeah, I think it's an area that touches so many people in so many different ways. Typically, they have a saying, standards are great so long as you pick mine, and change is great, you go first. It's just, people's sort of natural aversion to doing things differently from the way they've been doing them for long periods of time, are often a factor. And getting everyone aligned, especially in a large global organization, can just be, very different, culturally and technology-wise. We've got different platforms around the globe. You're asking people to switch directions from what they've been using for years and years and what they may be comfortable with, both on the software and the hardware side potentially, as well as changing the way, their ways of working. If you're going from a waterfall approach to writing software and building applications to a more agile approach, it requires a pretty significant shift, not just in the technology organization, but in the company in general. So, those things are hard. They take a long periods of time, and everybody responds differently to those kinds of requests, and so it can be a fairly daunting task in any organization.
Was this your first stint in financial services? And the reason I ask that is really a larger question. Are there sort of industry nuances that you've seen that make maybe financial services, digital transformations within that industry more complex or harder or something different?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So this is my first sort of formal stint as the CIO of a large financial services organization, but I have a significant amount of experience dealing with financial services organizations from some of my past careers. And I would say there is something somewhat unique about the financial services space, and that is that number one, it tends to be very competitive. Small advantages in this area can be very significant on trading platforms, on the way people manage portfolios. It tends to get very bright people that tend to work on the leading edge of technology, and I think that so you get a lot of strong opinions, a lot of very smart people. It can make it a little more challenging to get everyone aligned, but you often have a lot of very creative and intelligent input that can go into the equation. So I would say, it does tend to be a little different from other markets I've worked in.
And does regulation play a role in digital transformation?
Yeah, I think regulation plays a role in just about everything in the financial services space. You've got, and obviously being in a global organization, the regulatory requirements are different all around the world. And so, we've become very good at sort of addressing, regulatory requirements relatively quickly. Because there are so many, whether it's GDPR or open banking, depending on where in the world you are, there's just tremendous regulatory changes going on in the space right now. And that definitely impacts the way we write software, the way we promote production code into the market, the way we deal with our clients, and the way we deal with the regulators. It's extremely important that we take that into consideration when we build products.
So can we drill down a little bit into, I guess, the playbook that you used when you joined Experian to undergo and spearhead this digital transformation?
Yeah, the first thing was sort of looking at the overall estate, inside an organization of this size and this complexity, and that does span the globe. It was very important to sort of get an inventory and an understanding of how we were doing things sort of around the world, and then look for areas of synergies where we could bring people together. There was sort of a proliferation of different software being used inside the organization, whether it was database technology or programming languages. And I think there was also a strong sense in the technology organization that there was benefit in common ways of working and standardizing platforms. So there was a very receptive audience to a transformation, which I think is really important. And the other thing that was critical in an environment like this, because there are so many bright people and there is a lot of history, was getting alignment involved really giving people an opportunity to share their opinions and participate in the process. Now, it's important to emphasize that doesn't mean that everybody necessarily had to agree, but everybody had to be given an opportunity to express their opinion and be heard. And so we spent a lot of time sort of looking at areas of opportunity, and then understanding where we thought we had the highest degree of receptivity to making change. So whether it was standardizing around Hadoop platforms or standardizing around programming languages or standardizing around agile scaling methodologies, a lot of it involved basically getting the groups together, allowing them to share their opinions, and then making some decisions. And obviously, in an organization of this size and scale, you're not going to get 100% agreement. But if you give people the opportunity to participate, you're much more likely to get acceptance and agreement and alignment, even when there may be a difference of opinion. It's important to point out that the contrary can be true as well, that even when people tend to agree and be aligned, if you don't allow them to participate in the process, they're still not going to be as receptive to the changes that you're making. And so inclusion is just really an important aspect of this. And now that doesn't mean that everything becomes a complete democracy that simply can't work, but it means that you try to have things sort of be as democratically done as you possibly can. And at the end of the day, decisions have to be made in order to keep things moving forward. But there's a strong process that's been put in place to keep things moving. That was a big part of the approach here.
That was a really good point about both sides of inclusion. Can you speak to specific techniques that you used to get everybody to participate? You mentioned, standardizing on programming languages or to-do lists or to-do software. Were there certain things you did, I guess, culturally that got people sort of to align with a shared vision?
Yeah, I think, one of the really critical aspects when you're new in any kind of a role is sort of understanding who the thought leaders are within an organization. And so, especially when you've got an organization with a lot of really smart people in it, there are certain individuals that people look to for guidance or for recommendations, or who tend to basically have strong views, or a strong vision on how things should be done. So one of the most important things, early on, was sort of understanding who, the individuals were inside the company that were perceived as being thought leaders that could help in the transformation process in terms of making it effective and driving it forward. This is something that has to be done, organization wide. It's not something that can be driven by just one individual. It requires, lots of sponsorship and lots of participation. And so, the first thing was to sort of understand, who are the people inside the organization that are really that are really capable of having the most impact in making a transformation like this effective. And so we sort of brought those people into the fold, had them really get involved with workshops and sort of understand where they thought we needed to take the technology organization, sort of got everybody on the same page, and then sort of used a blanket approach across the enterprise to kind of drive those changes and let those individuals be an important part of making it effective.
And I guess what role did those individuals have who were the thought leaders, I guess, going forward, and sort of now the everyday sort of, humdrum of work? Um, do they maintain sort of a different role, I guess, in the organization going forward?
Yeah, I think that people who tend to be thought leaders within an organization sort of always, even when their jobs change, people still tend to look to them as thought leaders within an organization. So I would say that a lot of those individuals, still play a very similar role to the role they played 4 years ago. And a lot of them actually do have a specific role to play in the transformational activity. They're either driving it regionally, or they're driving it from within a specific business unit. We've gone from an operating model where platforms and technology were often regionally developed, potentially in silos. So we may have a system that operated in the UK with the same name as a system that operated in the US. And 4 years ago, those systems, may have shared nothing more than a common name. Today, there's a common code base that's often shared amongst our application stack. And that's because those individuals who are thought leaders were able to help put models in place where we shared things across regions, as opposed to just within a specific region. So those individuals have been and are pretty critical to sort of changing the way we work, making sure that we have more reusable technology, that we think globally as an organization as opposed to just regionally. So those individuals, absolutely are continuing to play a role in this process. I also think that, while there's a lot of heavy lifting that goes on initially when you do something like this, you get it into a state where I don't think it doesn't end. I mean, you need to constantly be reevaluating the way you're doing things. And so while initially the changes are much more significant and major in scale and scope, if the system is put in place properly, it's an ongoing process where the changes are much less significant, but they continue to occur as the organization evolves. And so, yes, we did a lot of heavy lifting 2-3 years ago. The amount of lifting that we're doing now continues, but it's not nearly of the same magnitude that it was 3 years ago, because we have a lot more in place to keep the process running.
Yeah, and from what you're saying, Barry, I mean, it really sounds like the transformation process never really ends. It just evolves. And to that point, can you point to specific things that the organization can do now? I guess I was going to say on the other side of transformation, it's not. It's still in that continuous transformation that you're describing. But are there things that you guys can do now that you could, like, tangible things that maybe when you joined in 2015 would have been a stretch for the company?
Yeah, I think that it was important for us to get the technology organization to where we wanted it to be before we started putting pressure, I think, on other parts of the company and organization. I think that too often people look at these types of transformation as a single organizational activity. This is not just about the technology organization. This is about other parts of the company as well, whether it's the HR organization or the finance organization. As we change the way we build platforms and the way we interface with customers, the model, the other aspects of how we run the business are changing at the same time. And so as you move from a waterfall development methodology and move everybody into a more agile way of working, you also need to change the way funding requests are done and the way budgeting is done, because you're doing things more incrementally as opposed to sort of in a big bang approach. So one of the big shifts and one of the things we're starting to look at now more aggressively is the ways of working outside of just the IT organization to sort of mirror or dovetail into the transformational work we've done in IT. And I think that, while you can do a lot of that work in parallel, once you have sort of that IT structure in place, it allows you to more aggressively go after some of the other functions inside an organization to make sure that everything's working in a more synchronized fashion. So, I think too many people think that it's just about the technology piece. There's other parts of an organization that are going to be impacted as well.
I guess with the benefit of hindsight, are there things you would have done differently looking backwards now, as part of that, to have, I guess, changed or um, directed the ship in a little different direction looking backwards?
Yeah, that's hindsight is always 2020, as they say. I think fortunately in this case there's a couple of sort of tactical or more subtle things that we may have done differently. We may have started more aggressively in one region of the world than another, but all in all, I think I'm pretty pleased with where we're at and what we've accomplished in the last 4 years. I think one of the challenges for anybody in a technology leadership role is to remember that you really need to look at these things from a macro perspective, not a micro perspective. I mean, if we evaluate the performance and the changes that we've made, over the last 30 days, it can be very frustrating because it doesn't feel as if the needle has moved a great deal. But when you look at them, on an annualized basis, if I look at where we are today versus where we were a year ago or where we were 2 years ago, I feel much more comfortable about the journey we've been on. There's still a lot of heavy lifting to be done and a lot of work to be done. But I think in the last 3 or 4 years, we've really moved the organization in a significant way. And I think you sort of see that in the company's growth, in the response that we're getting from customers, the introduction of we've been able to introduce a lot of new products in a very rapid succession over the last 12 months or so that have been really impactful on the market. So I think to me, the best demonstration of the results is the performance of the company. And so if I look at it from that lens, I feel pretty good about where we're at. There are a few things I may have done differently, but all in all, it feels pretty good.
Definitely. And I guess it's an interesting question. Given one of the themes that we cover a lot on this podcast is sort of the growing interconnectedness of the financial industry, but via APIs and sort of platform building. As you started, I guess, how much of a part of your thinking and planning was sort of the outward facing part of your company? What kind of role did that play in sort of your planning of the digital transformation within Experian?
Yeah, it was pretty significant. The idea of really sort of changing our approach in terms of how we deliver software to our customers and really putting the power in their hands to sort of say, look, we love the data and the insights that you provide, but we want to consume them in a different way. We want them either through an API interface, or we want them running in the cloud instead of on-prem, or any number of other sort of, subtle differences from the way we had historically been doing things played a really big role. And it required looking sort of outward at potential partnerships, where somebody else may be, for example, it just didn't make sense to us to build out an API hub of our own when there were a number of other very large players in the market, that this was an area where we were much better served by partnering with somebody than necessarily building it out entirely on our own. So for example, we built out, we worked with Apogee to build out our API hub several years ago, and we're now pushing, over 1 billion transactions a year through that platform. And it's growing, by orders of magnitude on a pretty regular basis. That was an area, that was something that we absolutely knew we needed to be able to introduce based on customer feedback, but it was something that we were best served by working in the ecosystem to find somebody to partner with, as opposed to sort of building out that hub ourselves. And it's been wildly successful. There's lots of other examples of things like that. We had to sort of pick who we were going to partner with on the Hadoop front. There's several vendors. There's a lot of competition in the space. It doesn't make sense for us to have multiple versions of the Hadoop platform in our environment. There's a lot more efficiency in picking a common platform, but moving everybody in that direction and sort of partnering with one large firm was a really big step for us. Same thing sort of when we picked our platform as a service development environment. We needed something that would run in the clouds, the public cloud, the private cloud, on-prem. In colos, we needed basically a sort of a ubiquitous development environment to be able to leverage, and we needed it to be open source so that we could effectively run it anywhere. Picking those kinds of things and identifying the partners was a pretty critical aspect of the transformation. And again, that's also one of those things that is sort of an ongoing process as our technology evolves, where we're always sort of looking to partners and potential technologies that will give us an advantage in the marketplace.
So also, Barry, beyond the, I guess, the build versus buy decision for those different types of technologies, you described this process where you got a lot of input from customers or partners. You talked about sort of not consensus building, but inclusion, I guess, earlier with your internal workforce. Was there an inclusion element, getting partners and customers on board as well?
Yeah, a lot of it was. I mean, I think most people know, and I will even admit this about myself. Most technology people are somewhat introverted, and so it can be challenging to go out and put yourself out in front of customers and sort of have that level of interaction. We typically rely on salespeople in the sales organization to do that. I think it's really important, however, for really good technology leaders to be able to play that role as well, so that things don't get lost in translation. So it was really important to me early on to work very closely with our sales organization and our largest customers to sort of understand where they were going from a technology direction standpoint. What was it that was important to them? How were they building products? What were they hearing from their customers, so that we could make sure we were adapting our strategy to be consistent with theirs. I think that's hard for a lot of technology organizations to do, because technology leaders, often don't get out in front of customers as often as they would like. But we made it a very important part of the role. And when I say that, I actually mean on a global basis. So whether it was spending time in Southeast Asia, different parts of Europe, with our largest customers in the United States, because their requirements are very different depending on what region of the world you're in. So that level of interaction with both clients and also with third parties. I mean, we set up an environment specifically to allow startups and fintechs to have access to sort of to have access to our data structure, so that they could also build applications, before they were ready to introduce or participate in commercial terms with us. So opening up the ecosystem to third parties, as well as interfacing with customers to understand their requirements, was a big part of the transformational activity when we were first kicking it off.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. I guess we have time for one last question. Looking out into the back end of 2019, what are some of your and your teams and company-wide goals, I guess, big audacious goals that you're looking to accomplish on the back end of the year?
Yeah, I mean, there's been some really interesting advancements, particularly obviously in the areas of machine learning and artificial intelligence, and that stuff plays can play a very significant role in the decisioning process, on analytical models, on insights, and so one of the things that we're spending an enormous amount of time, like most firms, is is in the area of machine learning and artificial intelligence and sort of introducing some of those capabilities into the market. The other is taking some of the technology around big data and analytics that we've introduced domestically and or introduced in the U.S. and introducing it in other parts of the world. That we have an analytical sandbox that we call Ascend that was something we introduced in 2018 that I think exceeded most of our expectations in terms of the market receptivity. It's really cool technology. It's very visually oriented. You can layer any kind of presentation layer on top of it, but it can do sort of, very sophisticated analytical models in real time on gigantic, data sets. It's based on very state-of-the-art technology. And right now, we've been very successful with it in the U.S. It's something that we're getting ready and in the process of introducing in other parts of the world. That is an exciting part of 2019 for us. There's a lot of other things happening in the alternative data space right now. We're doing things that allow consumers to introduce non-traditional credit information into their credit profile. So things like rental information or cell phone data, things that aren't typically collected, or utility bills. And we have this program that we call Boost that we launched, and that's something else that in 2019 we expect to sort of continue to promote and to push in other parts of the world. So a lot of interesting technology that's scheduled to be rolled out over the next 12 months or so.
Barry, thanks for joining us on the Tearsheet podcast today.
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me, Zach. Really appreciate it.